You can feel it before you see it. The quiet tension in the price of things, the slow rise that no one fully explains, the pressure that lives in every paycheck, the one that never seems to stretch as far as it used to. It is the same feeling governments have when they balance their books and realize the math no longer adds up. It's the same hum behind every news story about rates, deficits, and markets, something invisible but constant. That's the sound of the dollar at work, shaping what the world earns, what it spends, and what it dares to dream of. Most people don't think about it. They see headlines about inflation or hear politicians argue about budgets and they tune out. Because it sounds distant, like another language, but it's not distant at all. It's here, in your wallet, in your rent, in the cost of living you wake up to every morning. This isn't a story about policy or politics. It's a story about power, the kind that hides in plain sight. A quiet, deliberate force that has spent decades weaving the world together through debt, trust, and the illusion of stability. Before we start, take a moment. This isn't the kind of story you rush. Let it settle. And if you enjoy understanding how the world really works, how history, money, and psychology intersect, you might consider subscribing or leaving a comment. Tell me where you're listening from, because this story touches everyone whether you realize it or not. To understand it, we have to go back to a world still covered in the dust of war. The year was 1944. The world was exhausted. Nations were broke. Currencies were collapsing. And in a quiet hotel in New Hampshire, representatives from 44 countries gathered to decide how to rebuild everything. Out of that meeting came an agreement, a promise, really, that would shape the next century. The United States would anchor the global financial system. Every other currency would link itself to the dollar, and the dollar would link itself to gold. It sounded like stability. It sounded like trust restored. But beneath that promise was a quiet truth. America already held most of the world's gold. Its factories were running. Its banks were full. Its military was untouchable. So while the agreement was signed in cooperation, the balance of power had already shifted. The dollar didn't just represent value, it became the definition of it. And when a single currency defines value, it also defines dependence. The world began to revolve around that idea, and that's where the real story begins. In the decades that followed, the system grew, elegant, quiet, and absolute. Trade blossomed, loans flowed. The world rebuilt itself brick by brick on American credit. The dollar became more than a measure of worth. It became oxygen. If a nation wanted to import oil, build roads, or stabilize its currency, it needed dollars. If it wanted to borrow, it borrowed in dollars. If it wanted to save, it saved in dollars. At first, this was celebrated as progress, proof that humanity had finally built something stable after centuries of chaos. But the truth hiding underneath was simpler. The world had traded independence for efficiency. And once you start relying on someone else's money, you stop being in control of your own future. The arrangement worked for a while. Then came the 1960s. America was spending heavily on war, on industry, on influence. Its gold reserves began to shrink, while dollars flooded the globe. Other nations started to notice the imbalance. France, led by Charles de Gaulle, began exchanging its paper dollars for real gold. Others followed, and when too many hands reached for what little gold was left, the illusion cracked. In August 1971, President Richard Nixon appeared on television and calmly announced that the U.S. would no longer exchange dollars for gold. He called it temporary. It wasn't. That moment ended centuries of monetary tradition. Money was no longer tied to anything solid. It became faith, collective, fragile, and easily shaken. But in that same moment, America discovered something extraordinary. If your currency is the one the world uses, you don't need gold to back it. You can back it with belief. And belief turned out to be far more flexible. Because now the U.S. could print as much as it wanted, borrow as much as it needed. And the rest of the world, still anchored to the dollar, had no choice but to adjust. Yet belief alone can't sustain an empire forever. It needs structure. It needs something tangible to anchor faith. That anchor appeared 2 years later in the middle of another global crisis: oil. In 1973, oil prices exploded. The world panicked. And quietly, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia. In exchange for protection and partnership, every barrel of oil sold anywhere on Earth would be priced in US dollars. It was a stroke of genius. Energy, the lifeblood of civilization, was now tied to one currency. Every country that needed fuel first had to buy dollars. And those dollars, once earned, flowed back into American banks, bonds, and markets. It was a perfect loop. Spend, borrow, recycle, repeat. The arrangement was so seamless that it hardly seemed remarkable. But in that simplicity was a kind of quiet domination. The dollar became the middleman of the planet. Every exchange, every trade, every deal passed through it. And with each transaction, America's influence deepened. This wasn't empire in the traditional sense. There were no colonies, no flags planted in foreign soil, just economics, subtle, clean, efficient. A kind of control that didn't look like control at all. While other nations built factories, America built debt. It issued bonds, printed currency, and exported credit, all while importing goods, oil, and the illusion of prosperity. And because the world needed the dollar, the system kept spinning. The brilliance of it was that no one had to lose openly. Everyone benefited, at least at first. But over time, the imbalance grew impossible to ignore. The U.S. could live perpetually beyond its means, while others lived perpetually beneath theirs. Factories in Asia worked through the night to produce goods paid for in paper. Oil-rich nations banked their profits in American institutions. And the debt, invisible yet enormous, became the quiet heartbeat of the modern age. As the years passed, the system learned how to hide its weight. Debt became invisible, folded into prices, wages, and headlines about growth. The world adjusted, like a body learning to live with a low-grade fever. The U.S. could borrow endlessly because the world kept lending endlessly. Every crisis, every war, every downturn, every bailout was financed not through sacrifice, but through more borrowing. The more the United States owed, the more the world seemed to trust it. It was a strange kind of magic. Power created from the very thing that should have weakened it. But power has a cost. When one nation's borrowing defines the world's stability, everyone else becomes a hostage to its choices. When America spends, others must save. When it prints money, others absorb inflation. When it raises interest rates, others drown in debt. Latin America felt it first. In the 1980s, rising U.S. rates triggered a wave of defaults across the region. Factories closed, currencies collapsed. Generations were lost to austerity. And through it all, the institutions that promised relief, the IMF, the World Bank, were there, offering loans that came with instructions. Cut spending, sell your industries, open your markets, do what's necessary to remain creditworthy. It was a quiet extraction, more effective than conquest. Entire nations became clients, not through war but through obligation. Debt was no longer a number, it was policy, it was control. Asia came next. In the 1990s, the same cycle repeated. Rapid growth, easy credit, sudden collapse. Then the same medicine: austerity, restructuring, dependence. Each time the message was clear. You can play in the global economy, but only by the rules set in Washington. And so the dollar's power became self-reinforcing. Every crisis made it stronger. Every failure somewhere else pushed the world deeper into its orbit. The system was global, but the consequences were not evenly shared. You can still see the pattern today. When the U.S. raises interest rates to tame its own inflation, currencies in Africa, Asia, and South America crumble. Food prices rise, debt repayments balloon. And all over the world, ordinary people feel the shock of a decision made in a room they'll never see. The logic is simple. When your life depends on a currency you don't control, your freedom is borrowed. And borrowed freedom isn't freedom at all. But this isn't just a story about nations, it's also about people, about how the logic of global finance seeps into everyday life. Because debt doesn't stay in boardrooms or parliaments. It moves into homes, into minds, into the quiet anxiety that hums beneath modern existence. You see it when someone works 3 jobs and still can't save, when a family measures success by the size of its mortgage, when a student begins adulthood already in debt. The same mechanisms that tie nations to dollars tie people to loans, the same illusion of stability, the same dependence on tomorrow. We've built a civilization where money is created through borrowing, and then wonder why everyone feels they owe something, even those who've done nothing wrong. It's not greed that keeps it running, it's momentum, and no one knows how to stop. Because if debt is the foundation, what happens when people stop believing it can hold? Belief held for a long time. Long enough for generations to grow up never questioning it. The dollar became invisible, like air, everywhere and unexamined. People didn't wonder why it was trusted. They just trusted it because everyone else did. But belief isn't eternal. It fades quietly, the way light drains from a room at dusk. And when it goes, it doesn't vanish in an instant. It flickers. It doubts. The flicker began in 2008. A crisis born in American banks sent shockwaves through the planet. Homes vanished. Jobs evaporated. Markets froze. And yet somehow, amid the chaos, the dollar didn't collapse. It strengthened. It made no sense. The same system that had caused the disaster was rewarded with even more power. Because when everything else burns, people run toward the fire they know. That's the paradox of trust. Even when it betrays you, you still go back to it. The US printed trillions to save its markets, and the world absorbed it without protest. It was proof of the system's genius, or its madness. Because if money can be created endlessly, what does it still mean? And if debt is infinite, where does responsibility end? The cracks deepened in the years that followed. Sanctions turned money into a political weapon. Countries watched as reserves, the savings of entire nation, could be frozen overnight by decisions made in Washington. And quietly, they began to plan their exits. China and Russia started trading in their own currencies. India experimented with bilateral deals. Saudi Arabia began exploring new arrangements for oil. Central banks around the world bought gold for the first time in decades. None of this happened loudly. It never does. But history rarely announces its turning points until they've already passed. You can feel it in the air now, that faint unease, that sense that the story no longer adds up. The US owes more than it earns. It spends more than it saves. Its debt has grown so large that it no longer feels like a number, but a myth. $30 trillion, and counting. And yet the belief holds because it must, because if the dollar falls, the whole structure shakes. It's not just America that depends on faith, it's everyone. This is the quiet danger of a world bound by one currency. It creates unity, but also fragility. It builds peace, but at the cost of autonomy. It makes cooperation look like dependence, and stability feel like stillness. And beneath it all, the same silent hum continues, the sound of a promise stretched thinner every year. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Empires don't collapse when they're weak. They collapse when they've exhausted belief. When people stop pretending the story still makes sense. That's what happened to Rome, to Spain, to Britain. And someday, inevitably, it will happen again. The signs are everywhere, not dramatic, just persistent. Inflation that eats savings. Debt that grows faster than production. A middle class that feels poorer, even in times of prosperity. Confidence that sounds rehearsed instead of real. The war never ended. It only changed form. Instead of tanks, it uses interest rates. Instead of invasions, it uses incentives. And instead of soldiers, it uses citizens. Because every person who spends, saves, or borrows in dollars is fighting to keep the system alive, whether they mean to or not. Maybe that's the most haunting part of it all. That this war doesn't feel like war at all. It feels like routine, like paydays, shopping carts, and numbers glowing on a phone screen. It feels like the comfort of stability, until the bill arrives. The dollar's power was never about wealth alone. It was about trust. about the collective agreement that this paper, this symbol, could hold the weight of the world's ambition. But what happens when that trust begins to thin? When generations start to see that value has become performance, that the stage is bigger, the lights brighter, but the floor beneath it all is hollow? Every empire tells itself that it's different, that this time history won't repeat. But debt doesn't care about pride. It only grows, quietly, patiently, until even the strongest economies begin to feel the strain of their own reflection. And still, we carry on. We go to work. We pay bills. We watch numbers move on screens and call it progress. Somewhere deep down we know it can't last forever. But the illusion is comforting, and so we protect it. We defend it. Because to question it would mean to question everything built upon it. The dollar was born from necessity, fed by confidence, and crowned by belief. But belief is the most fragile empire of all. It can survive wars, depressions, even collapse, but not doubt. And doubt is spreading quietly like cracks in glass. The next global order won't begin with explosions or headlines. It will begin with whispers. Trade deals signed in different currencies, quiet shifts in reserves, slow withdrawals from the system we once thought eternal. And when the world finally looks up, it won't see an empire falling. It will see one fading, like smoke. But there's something strangely human in that. The same force that built this system, ambition, trust, the desire to believe, is what will eventually replace it. Every generation rewrites the rules it inherits. Ours will too. The question is whether we'll learn from the silence that came before. Maybe that's what the dollar's silent war has really been about. Not dominance, but dependence. Not control, but conviction. And now that conviction is trembling. So take a moment. Look at the world around you. The prices, the debts, the invisible balances that shape your every choice. Behind them is a story that began long before you were born and will keep unfolding long after you're gone. But for now, you're part of it. Every time you buy, save, borrow, or dream, you're playing your part in the quietest war ever fought. If this made you think differently about what money means, what trust costs, tell me what you see coming next. Do you think belief can outlast reality, or are we already watching the curtain fall? Stay curious, stay awake, and remember, power doesn't disappear when it's questioned. It just changes form. The dollar's war was never truly about gold or oil or debt. It was about faith. And faith, once broken, doesn't explode. It erodes, one quiet choice at a time.